Good evening everyone. My name is Janine Padayao and today I will going to report chapter 12 Heart. In chapter 12, we have these subtopics functions of the heart, and at the end of the lesson, students must be able to list the major functions of the heart, size, form, and location of the heart. They can describe the size, shape, and location of the heart and explain why knowing its location is important. Third, anatomy of the heart. They can describe the structure of pericardium, give the location and function of the coronary arteries, name the valves of the heart and state their location and functions, and describe the flow of blood through the heart and name each of the chambers and structure through the blood passes. Next is the histology of the heart, wherein at the end of the lesson, they can list the components of the heart wall, describe the structure and function of each, and describe the structural functional characteristic of the cardiac muscle cells. To begin with, let's first define what is heart. So, we often refer heart as the set of strong emotion. For example, we may describe a very determined person as in love or having lot of hearts, or say that a person who has been disappointed romantically has a broken heart. And those emotions are product of brain function, not the heart function. So the heart is a muscular organ that is essential for life because it pumps blood through the body. And then like a pump, forces water through a pipe, the heart contracts forcefully to pump blood through the body blood vessel. But if the heart loses its pumping ability for even a few minutes, then the person's life is in danger. Although it is a single structure, the heart is actually two pumps in one. The pulmonary circulation moves blood between the heart and the lungs. It transports the oxygenated blood to the lungs to absorb oxygen and release carbon dioxide. So the oxygenated blood then flows back to the heart. Next is the systemic circulation. It moves blood between the heart and the rest of the body. It carries oxygen and nutrients to the cell and picks up the carbon dioxide and waste product. Let's come now to the functions of the heart. We have four. First, generating blood pressure. The contractions of the heart generate blood pressure, wherein it forces blood through the blood vessels. Second, routing blood. The heart separates the pulmonary and systemic circulations, which ensures the flow of oxygen-rich blood to tissues. Third, ensuring one-way blood flow. The valves of the heart ensure one-way flow of blood through the heart and the blood vessels. Lastly, regulating blood supply. The changes in the rate and force of the heart contraction match blood flow to the changing metabolic needs of the tissues during rest, exercise, and changes in body position. The next subtopic will be the size, form, and locations of the heart. When it comes to the size of the heart, alam naman nating lahat na our heart is shaped like a blunt cone and approximately like the size of our closed fist. Yes po, as you can see at the picture, our heart is just like a closed fist. Did you know that it is larger physically in active adults than in the less active? And as we grow older, our heart also grows. But the heart decreases in size after approximately age 65. Yan, the size of our heart will decrease when we reach 65, especially kapag di tayo masyadong active physically. So next is the form of the heart. Meron po tayong tinatawag na base, wherein it is the larger flat part of the opposite end of the heart. As you can see at the picture, yun po yung ating base. Next is the apex. It is the blunt rounded point ng ating heart. Next is the mediastinum, the midline partition formed by the heart, trachea, esophagus, and the associated structures. So, the locations of our heart, it is located at the thoracic cavity sa pagitan ng dalawang pleural cavities that surrounds our lungs. So, pericardial cavity, from the word peri, around, and cardio, heart, it is the cavity that surrounds the heart. To make it more clear, as you can see at the picture, the heart lies obliquely in the mediastinum, with its base directed posteriorly and slightly superiorly and its apex directed anteriorly and slightly inferiorly. So the apex is also directed to the left so that approximately 2/3 of the heart mass lies on the left of the midline of the sternum. So yung base ng ating heart is located deep to the sternum and extends to the level of the second intercostal space. The apex is depth to the left fifth intercostal space, approximately 7 to 9 cm to the left of the sternum, near the mid-clavicular line, which is perpendicular line that extends down from the middle of the clavicle. Let's proceed now to the third subtopics of the heart, which is the anatomy of the heart. We have this term pericardium, or the pericardial sac, in which it surrounds the heart and anchors it within the mediastinum. Pericardium protects and lubricates our heart and keep it in place within our chest. We have this two layer of pericardium, which is the pebrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. When we say pebrous pericardium, it is the outer layer of the pericardium. It is made of thick connective tissues and attached to the diaphragm. It holds our heart and place in the chest cavity and protects from the infections. Next is the serous pericardium. It is the inner layer of the pericardium that consists of flat epithelial cells with a thin layer of connective tissue. It is further divided into two more layers, the visceral and the parietal layer. The parietal pericardium is the part lining the pebrous pericardium, while the visceral pericardium or epicardium is the part covering the heart surface. While the pericardial cavity is located between the parietal and the visceral pericardia, in which it is filled with a thin layer of pericardial fluid, na kung saan ang ating pericardial fluid ay pinuproduce ng serous pericardium, wherein it can helps to reduce friction as the heart moves within the pericardium. Let's come now to the external anatomy of the heart, wherein meron tayong right and left atria na makikita sa base of the heart. Next is the right and left ventricles naman extended from the base of the heart toward the apex. The coronary sulcus extends around the heart, separating the atria from the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus extends inferiorly from the coronary sulcus on the anterior surface of the heart, while the posterior interventricular sulcus extends inferiorly from the coronary sulcus on the posterior surface of the heart. Next, meron tayong 6 na large vein that carries blood to the atria of the heart. We have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava that carries blood from the body to the right atrium. We also have the 4 pulmonary veins that carry blood from the lungs to the left atrium, and the 2 pulmonary arteries called the great vessel or the great arteries, in which it carry blood away from the ventricles of the heart. The pulmonary trunk arising from the right ventricle splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, while the aorta arising from the left ventricle carries blood to the rest of the body. Our heart is composed of heart chambers. We have the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and the left ventricle. So, ang ating atria ang nagsisilbing imbakan, wherein blood returning from the veins collect before it enters the ventricle. So, the right atrium receives blood from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, wherein it drains blood from most of the body. Coronary sinus drains blood from most of the heart muscle, while the left atrium receives blood through the 4 pulmonary veins, in which it drains blood from the lungs. The left and right atria was separated by the partition called interatrial septum. So, punta naman tayo sa ating ventricles, wherein our ventricles are the major pumping chambers. They eject blood into the arteries and force it to flow through the circulatory system. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, while the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta. The 2 ventricle is separated by a partition called interventricular septum. Meron tayong dalawang uri ng heart valves, which is the atrioventricular valve and the semilunar valves. So, ang ating atrioventricular valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The tricuspid valve is an AV valve located between the right atrium and the right ventricle, wherein it has 3 cusps. Next is the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. It is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle, wherein it has 2 cusps. These valves allow blood to flow from the atria into the ventricle, but it prevents it from flowing back into the atria. So meron tayong mga muscular pillars that each ventricle has, and it is called papillary muscles. While our chordae tendineae is a thin, strong connective tissue string that attaches the papillary muscle to the free margin of cusp of the atrioventricular valves. So ang semilunar valve is located between each ventricle and it is associated as great artery. Our pulmonary semilunar valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, while the aortic semilunar valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. Even though blood flow is described for the right and the left side of the heart, it is important to understand that both atria contract at the same time, and both ventricles contract at the same time. This concept is most important when considering the electrical activity, pressure, changes, and the heart sound. Blood enters the right atrium from the systemic circulation through the superior and inferior vena cava, and from the heart muscle through the coronary sinus. Most of the blood flowing into the right atrium flows into the right ventricle, while the right ventricle relaxes following the previous contraction. Before the end of ventricular relaxation, the right atrium contracts and enough blood is pushed from the right atrium to the right ventricle to complete right ventricular filling. Following the right atrial contraction, the right ventricle begins to contract. This contraction pushes blood against the tricuspid valve, forcing it to close. After pressure within the right ventricle increases, the pulmonary semilunar valve is forced to open and blood flows into the pulmonary trunk. As the right ventricle relaxes, it pressures falls rapidly and pressure in pulmonary trunk becomes greater than the right ventricle. So, the backflow of the blood forces the pulmonary semilunar valve to close. Pulmonary trunk branches to form the right and left pulmonary arteries, which carry blood to the lungs where carbon dioxide is released and the oxygen is picked up. Blood returning from the lungs enters the left atrium through the four pulmonary veins. Most of the blood flowing into the left atrium passes into the left ventricle, while the left ventricle relaxes following the previous contraction. Before the end of ventricular relaxation, the left atrium contracts and enough blood is pushed from the left atrium into the left ventricle to complete the left ventricular filling. Following the left atrial contraction, the left ventricle begins to contract, and this contraction pushes blood against the bicuspid valve, forcing it to close. After pressure within the left ventricle increases, the aortic semilunar valve is forced to open, and blood flows into the aorta. The blood flowing through the aorta is distributed to all the parts of the body, except to those parts of the lungs supplied by the pulmonary blood vessels. As the left ventricle relaxes, its pressures falls rapidly and pressures in the aorta becomes greater than in the left ventricle. The backflow of the blood forces the aortic semilunar valve to close. For you to be able to understand clearly the route of the blood flow through the heart, kindly take a look at this picture, and the step process of blood flow through the heart is represented in this graphic organizer. Let's come now to blood supply to the heart. Coronary arteries originate from the base of the aorta, just above the aortic valves, and coronary arteries supply blood to all the wall of the heart. The left coronary artery originates on the left side of the aorta, and this supply much of the anterior wall of the heart and most on the left ventricle. The left coronary artery has three major branches: the anterior interventricular artery, the circumflex artery, and the left marginal artery. So, yung anterior interventricular artery lies on the anterior interventricular sulcus, while the circumflex artery, it extends around the coronary sulcus on the left to the posterior surface of the heart, and the left marginal artery extends inferiorly along the lateral wall of the left ventricle from the circumflex artery. Then, yung right coronary artery originates on the right side of the aorta. It extends around the coronary sulcus on the right to the posterior surface of the heart. Yung right coronary artery natin supply most of the wall of the right ventricle. Ang ating right coronary artery has its two major branches. First is the posterior interventricular artery. wherein it is lies in the posterior interventricular sulcus. Next is the right marginal artery. It extends inferiorly along the lateral wall of the right ventricle. So kung nakikita nyo po ang ating picture sa ating left side, nandyan po yung coronary arteries natin. Nandyan yung right coronary artery and the left coronary arteries and its major branches. Next is our cardiac veins. So yung cardiac veins, it drains blood from the cardiac muscle. Their pathways are nearly parallel to the coronary arteries, and most of them drain blood into the coronary sinus. Wherein ang ating coronary sinus is a large vein located within the coronary sulcus and the posterior aspect of the heart. Blood flows from the coronary sinus into the right atrium, and some of the small cardiac veins drains directly into the right atrium. Our next subtopic is all about the histology of the heart. So our heart wall is composed of 3 layers of tissue. First is the epicardium, also called as the visceral pericardium. It is a thin serous membrane forming the smooth outer surface of the heart. Epicardium is consist of a simple squamous epithelium overlying a layer of loose connective tissues and adipose tissue. Next is the myocardium. It is a thick middle layer of the heart. It is composed of cardiac muscle cells and it is responsible for contractions of the heart chambers. And lastly, the endocardium. It is a smooth inner surface of the heart chambers wherein it is also consist of a simple squamous epithelium over a layer of connective tissues. The endocardium allows blood to move easily through the heart. So the heart valves are formed by folds of endocardium that is included in a thick layer of connective tissues. The surface of the anterior walls of the ventricle are modified by the ridges and columns of cardiac muscle called the trabeculae carneae. Smaller muscular ridges are also present in portions of the atria. Next is the cardiac muscle. It is the elongated, branching cells that contain one or occasionally two centrally located nuclei. It contains actin and myosin myofilaments organized to form sarcomeres, in which it is joined end-to-end to form myofibrils. So yung actin and myosin myofilaments, it is responsible to the muscle contractions, and their organization gives the cardiac muscle a straightened appearance much like that skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle cells are organized into spiral bundles or sheets. When cardiac muscle fibers contract, not only do the muscle fibers shorten, but the spiral bundle twist to compress the contents of the heart chambers. Cardiac muscle cells are bound end-to-end and laterally to adjacent cell by specialized cell-to-cell contacts called the intercalated disc. So yung membrane of the intercalated disc are highly folded and the adjacent cells fit together, greatly increasing contacts between them and preventing cell from falling apart. Specialized cell membrane structures and the intercalated disc called gap functions allow cytoplasm to flow freely between the cells. This enables actions potential to pass quickly and easily from one cell to the next. The cardiac muscle cell of the atria and ventricles therefore contract at nearly the same time. The heart's highly coordinated pumping action depends on these characteristics. That's the end of our video lesson. Hope you learned something from our discussion. Always take a good care of your heart. Thank you for listening everyone, and God bless.